Hello, this is Mr. B, and this is my recipe for candied squash, a family recipe that I've prepared for years, and in all those years I've never changed the recipe. This side dish is a great choice for several reasons. First of all, it pairs well with any meat entree, including beef, pork, lamb, or chicken. Secondly, it adds a starch to any lighter fare meal, like a seafood entree where potatoes would be just too much. Thirdly, it adds a sweet entree to balance the flavors of the meal. And finally, it adds a color to the plated presentation. Oh, and I have to add this, that candied squash can be prepared in advance, refrigerated, then microwaved before the meal with no loss of taste or freshness or appeal. It always tastes freshly made, and of course with the sugar content, the side dish retains heat very well. No problem leaving the serving bowl in the center of the table for duration of the dinner. Okay, so I'm so going to show you how to make this, and I hope you'll like it as much as I do. Now, there are many kinds of squash: zucchini squash, butternut, spaghetti, acorn. My favorite for this recipe is acorn squash, and of course, acorn squash is available in almost every grocery store, ranging in color from green to yellow, and with a thick stem and outer ribbing. The acorn squash is very easy to recognize. They're about 5 to 6 inches in diameter. They weigh under 2 pounds, and the range in price from 98 cents to $1.49 a pound. So you can expect to pay roughly $2 for an acorn squash that will serve 2 to 3 people, maybe 4, as a side dish. At $1 per person, that's a bargain. And it's a way larger serving than you would find in a restaurant. So as you can see, the first step is to remove the stem and cut the squash in half the long way. Then scoop out all the seeds and clean the internal cavities of both halves. The cavities will hold the butter and sugars while the squash is baking. So it's very important that you don't pierce through the bottom of the squash or the mixture will leak out. And of course, for the same reason, you don't want the squash to tip over while it's in the oven. The secret to keeping the squash level is to shave the bottom of each half so that it sits flat in a Pyrex dish. As you can see, I do this with a stiff-bladed knife, being very careful to remove only enough of the ribbing underneath to create a flat bottom. Again, without breaking through to the cavity of the squash. Next, pick a Pyrex or other oven-safe dish with a large enough footprint to hold the squash halves. The dish shown here is an OXO brand, and it measures 8 inches by 8.5 inches by 2.5 inches deep. And the two halves of squash fit very nicely into it. The depth of the dish is not very important as long as it will hold about a ½ inch of water, which you'll see in a couple minutes. Once the squash halves are placed and secured, it's time to fill the cavities with ingredients. Remember that all the ingredients I'm about to show you in the cavity of each squash half will be folded into the squash and become part of the serving. So in spite of the amounts I'm recommending, think in terms of how much butter and sugar is the right amount for each person. You may certainly adjust these measurements to your own liking. First, in each half of squash, place 1 to 2 tablespoons of butter in the bottom of the cavity. Whether sliced from a cube of butter or added as a melted equivalent, it doesn't matter. It's all going to melt anyway. Second, pick your favorite brown sugar. Light or dark, doesn't matter. I use light brown. Add 2 tablespoons to each cavity. Don't worry about mixing it. You'll do that later. And notice that my measure here is approximate. Again, precise measurements are not required. Thirdly, add about 1/8 cup of Caro syrup to each cavity, pouring it over the brown sugar and butter. Okay, you can see I'm using blue agave syrup this time. Just wanted to see if there was any difference in flavor, and there wasn't. So stay with Caro syrup if you're a purist like I am. When baking squash, it's important not to burn the top surface exposed to direct heat or the bottom surface sitting on the Pyrex dish. The easy way to keep the bottom from burning is to fill the Pyrex dish with about a ½ inch of water. Water will not rise above 212 degrees, and whatever amount of water evaporates during the baking will keep the exposed surfaces of the squash from dehydrating. This is an essential step. It's a must-do. And don't worry about the water being absorbed into the squash. The outer skin prevents that. Finally, just before placing the squash in the oven, generously salt and pepper the upper surfaces of the two squash halves. As you know, the standard protocol for seasoning is 2 parts salt to 1 part pepper. In this case, however, I found that equal amounts of both is the right ratio. When your oven has reached 350 degrees, it's time to carefully place your Pyrex dish on a middle shelf in the center of the oven. Don't use a convection setting. Simply set the oven to its regular bake setting. Your total bake time will be about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how supple you want the entrée to be, and I will explain that later. You will interrupt the baking a few times during the 45-minute cycle. The purpose is for you to periodically remove the squash, mix the ingredients in the cavity, and baste the top surface of the squash to keep it from drying out. This is equivalent to what you would do with a turkey in the oven. In this case, the most important thing to do is wear mitts or use heavy heating pads, because if you spill the water or squash, you'll have a total mess to clean up. So notice how carefully I'm being. I've made that mistake a few times. When your squash is done, simply remove the dish and place it on a surface where it won't slide around. You might want to set it on a heating pad on a cutting board. Next, lift out each squash with a large scoop and transfer it to a plate or bowl, making sure that you don't spill the ingredients in the cavities. Discard the Pyrex water dish and replace it with a serving dish. The final step is to scoop out the squash and the melted butter-sugar mixture into your serving dish. If your cook time was the minimum as shown here, the squash will be al dente, meaning still semi-hard and therefore harder to scoop out. In spite of the mixing, this will create a varied flavor profile, some bites being mostly squash and some being more buttery. On the other hand, if your cook time is the maximum, the squash will be easy to remove and easy to mix. In this case, the flavor profile will be the same with every bite. Okay, there we have it. I hope I didn't bore you with all the details, but I'm an engineer and I kind of can't help it. In any case, I really hope that you'll try this in your own kitchen. Maybe candied squash will become an heirloom recipe for your family as well.